This is Join Us in France, episode 374, 374. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel during the pandemic. Today, I bring you a conversation with Carlson about his leisurely trip to France. Carl and his wife know France very well because they've been coming for the last 30 years, and they have a superpower for finding outstanding accommodations and restaurants. After skipping 2020, because of the pandemic, they were eager to come back in 2021, and this time they spent some time in Paris, Bergerac, and in the Loire Valley. Carl has some great recommendations for affordable manor houses and chateaux and places where you can take a nice walk and savor each day. After the interview, I'll share news about France and about the pandemic in France. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my Paris tours on the Voice Map app, my cookbook, Join Us at the Table, and my popular itinerary planning service. You can browse all of that at Annie's Boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Bonjour, Carl, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Bonjour, Annie. Thank you for having me again.
It's lovely to have you back. You were on the podcast a few months back talking about one of your favorite places in France, Sancerre, and that was episode 304. And this time we're going to talk about, well, a lot of different places, but you spent some time in the Dordogne this time. And so we want to talk about that as well as this time you spent in Paris and a few COVID things and all of that. So you've been to France many times, haven't you, Carl?
Yes, we have. I think somewhere over 30 times. And interestingly enough, perhaps it's last year was the first year this century that we didn't return to France. We do try to come every year.
So how did COVID affect this trip?
Well, we weren't necessarily concerned because we both have been vaccinated 2 times. We had not yet had our boosters, but listening to your podcast, we realized that the vaccination rate in France was higher than it was here in Hawaii and throughout the United States. And so we might even be safer there in France than we would be here. Having said that, typically when we arrive in Paris, I mean, it's a long ways from Hawaii, and we arrive in Paris and spend a few nights there to try to catch up in a time zone. And we normally travel by the metro, and we also visit little museums. And this trip, we chose not to do that. We chose to spend just a little bit more time walking around and avoided the metro. And the only time we went to a museum was at the end of our trip when we went to the Pompidou Center to visit the Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah, the metro it takes a little, I don't know, it's close quarters, isn't it?
It is. But the good news is our flight arrived at 11:15 in the morning. It isn't delayed, and that was a good time to arrive because there's not much traffic driving into Paris.
Mm-hmm.
We like to stay at the Hyatt Regency Etoile out there, and granted that's a chain hotel, but it's not a touristy area, and it's very convenient access to and from the airport. Porte Maillot right there has auto rental locations, and so it's a good place to jump off from if you're going to drive someplace, and avoid driving in Paris once you get a car.
Right.
And then for us, we've been to Paris so many times. We're trekkers. We love to go for long walks, and it's only a 20-minute walk from there to the Arc de Triomphe. Across the periphery, there's the Bois de Boulogne.
Right.
And I believe you did a podcast on that a while ago. The Bois de Boulogne is, I think, almost 3 times the Central Park in New York. So it's big. We like to go out there and go for long walks, just see what's out there. And again, trying to adjust to the time change. And it's 12 hours in Hawaii and Paris time zone.
Mm-hmm.
Walking is an excellent way to kind of adjust to the time zone.
Right, because 12 hours is brutal.
It can be, yeah. And then the other thing, that area, there are a lot of restaurants that we know. It's one right across the periphery from the hotel called Sebillon, which is maybe over 100 years old at this point. I mean, it's an old-time Paris restaurant and has excellent seafood. It's only a 10-minute walk. Sebillon has one of their specialties is lamb, and they prepare it in an old style where they bring it to your table in a cart and they carve it. We always, it's one of the restaurants we go to regularly.
Mm-hmm. Sounds lovely.
And granted, that is a convention center right there. Once you get away from the hotel, you don't really run into a lot of tourists. A lot of the restaurants that you go to out there, you don't even hear the sound of English.
And how long does it take you to go from that hotel to, say, Notre Dame?
Notre Dame, pretty good hike. That's a little over an hour.
Okay, but if you took the metro?
If you take the metro, maybe 20 minutes. It's a straight shot down the Champs-Élysées, and there's a stop right there, very close to Notre Dame. So it's by metro, it's easy. If you're walking, it's an hour, maybe a little more. What the heck? We can do that.
So besides not taking the metro, did it really change anything else? COVID did?
No, not at all. We called, actually I sent an email to the hotel and asked them if there were going to be any restrictions we needed to worry about. And they said, it's bring your CVC card.
They changed the system around November 2nd. So before November 2nd, they wanted you to email. Then they said, you need to create an account. But then they completely stopped that. And they said, no, now you arrive in France, you go to one of the participating pharmacies, and they will take care of you. And there are lots and lots of pharmacies all over Paris and all over France that do this. And there's a website that lists them all. Well, no, it's not a list. It's a map. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that map for anybody who's listening wants to do that. So, and it's pretty easy. I mean, you just pay your fee. And people ask, what if I get my third dose? Well, I'm afraid you're gonna have to pay the fee do it again, to add, because they need to access your documents, and it takes about 15 minutes to do the whole process.
Yeah, and again, that peace of mind. Once you we felt almost like a badge of honor. We could walk in and flash our QR code. It was good.
Yeah, and for a while there, they stopped asking for the QR codes so much, but now that we're on an upswing again of cases, they ask for it again. So it's good to have it.
Yeah, and we didn't at any time feel that it was an imposition or it's something we shouldn't have to do. If those are the rules, what the heck, those are the rules, and there's a reason.
Right.
So that's what we did.
Yeah.
But getting back to Paris for a moment, I don't know if you've ever been to the Apple store on the Champs-Élysées.
Yeah.
We had to go pick up something, and that has got to be the most elegant Apple store in their system. And I never really thought of an Apple store as a destination for a visitor, but it's worth going by and taking a look.
Yeah, when I'm in Paris and I need the Apple store, I usually go to the one in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, but I walked by the one on the Champs-Élysées. I don't remember if I went in or not, but yeah, it's probably quite impressive.
It's a very handsome store, very large.
Yeah.
In an elegant old building, and it's an experience. So there's much more to Paris, I think, than going to see all of the big sites. I mean, it's nice to do that, and we're fortunate that we've done that. But the city itself is almost like a living museum, and it's amazing. The more you look, the more you find.
Sure.
You just walk around. It's amazing what you end up finding. And I know you have various walking tours, which are informative, but I think it's worth it for a traveler just when they're in Paris, you just go get lost. And quite frankly, it's pretty difficult to get lost.
Right. So this makes all kinds of sense for people who go back to Paris again and again and again, like you, because you know, you have time. Like if you get lost, or even if you walk through a neighborhood that's not so impressive, so what? You've looked at some cute dogs and some nice buildings, and you had a nice walk and you're happy about that. It's just people who are only here for a certain time. For them, it's wiser to plan some more and to do walking tours and to have kind of a plan. Otherwise, you're not going to see as much.
Absolutely. And we're blessed with being in a position to be able to return and visit France at our own pace, if you will.
Yeah. And so you took the train to Bordeaux?
We did. We took a taxi from the hotel to Montana station.
Yep.
And it was interesting. They had a team there that were checking QR codes. And so we gave them our QR code and they gave us a wristband, which then allowed us pretty much seamless access to the station, and restaurants there. And then it just facilitated getting on a train. About a 2-hour train ride to Bordeaux.
Yep.
And we were basically on our way to Bergerac. And we just thought with a little over 2-hour train ride and perhaps a 2-hour drive to Bergerac, how do we just spend the night in Bordeaux?
Mm-hmm.
We'd been there before.
Yeah, I was going to ask you why you only did one night in Bordeaux, because there's plenty to see. But if you had been before, that makes sense.
Yeah, we had been there before. And as we talked about earlier, we're trekkers. And so in the morning after breakfast, we went for a long walk along the river. Mm-hmm. And they have a lovely riverfront promenade. There's a lot of green space, garden. There's shops. Further you go, there's a long line of shops. And in an hour or two, walking along the river.
That's great. Yeah. Bordeaux is a lovely town. I mean, honestly.
It is.
Yeah. There's some nice walks you can have within the city, and it kind of looks like Paris a little bit more than other southern towns because it's that white stone everywhere. And they had a lot of it cleaned up not that long ago. And so it's nice and bright. Because for a long time, Bordeaux, when I was a kid, Bordeaux was all gray because the stone had gotten old. And then they had a mayor who decided that he was going to give tax rebates to homeowners who did a facade refurbish. And it worked. A lot of people did it, and it's a gorgeous town as a result.
And they have light rail that'll get you around the city relatively easily. Mm-hmm. And it is a lovely city.
Yeah. And then you went to Bergerac.
We did. And just rented a car there at the station, Sancerre, and drove to Bergerac. About a 2-hour drive. We made a stop along the way. Mm-hmm. And we stayed at a wonderful maison called Clos D'Argenson. And it's on Rue D'Argenson. Mm-hmm. I believe maybe you'd call it an old manor house.
Oh.
And these two guys from Paris bought it. And about 3 years ago, fixed it up a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I believe there's 5, possibly 6 rooms there. And our room was we thought especially nice in that it had a large sitting room. And that we were looking for something like that. It had a large sitting room. Bedroom was large bathroom. I mean, very pleasant. And the sitting room had huge casement windows that overlooked the garden and the pool area.
Right. I'm looking at it right now. It looks nice.
It's very nice. And one of the things that for us was about having a sitting room, Christine likes to do art. And so we go out and do our things in the morning. And then in the afternoon, we take a nap. And what she likes to do is to sit there and work on her art. She does a lot of artwork. Sometimes she does needlework. So in the afternoon when we're just kind of relaxed out and about, she can sit there and do her thing. And it's wonderful. I mean, I can sit and read. Actually, in many ways, I get a little antsy, and so I just get out and go. But
Right.
it just makes it a very comfortable place to stay.
Yeah. And so how far is it to the historical Bergerac Medieval Center?
5-minute walk.
Okay. And how are the beds? Are they soft or are they hard?
They're very comfortable.
Oh, good.
Very comfortable. Although I guess I'm blessed, I can sleep anywhere, anytime. But no, it was a lovely place to stay, and you don't really think of having access to laverie, the highlight of a trip, but maybe 100 meters from the accommodation, they had a very clean, modern laverie, and after having traveled for 5 nights, having access to fresh your clothes.
Right. So laverie is a laundromat. Yeah.
Yeah. And right across the street, of course, from the laundromat, they had a cafe, and next to it, the Carrefour Market.
Yeah, there you go.
And so we could buy our picnic we wanted. We could get anything we wanted. It was convenient. And I know you did a podcast on Bergerac. We enjoyed it, and quite frankly, I would have a little bit longer.
How long were you there?
We were there 3 nights. And the accommodation, as I said, very nice. It's run by Francoise and Jean-Luc. And Francois' father was a relatively famous textile designer. And so the print or the proof that he used for the textile design, they framed and they've hung throughout the maison. And so the artwork, a lot of the artwork done by Francois' father. So it was unique. They had other artwork, of course, but it was unique, and we enjoyed checking it out. They have a small dining room that I would say comfortably would fit perhaps 8. They had it set up for 6, and we had breakfast in the dining room, and the breakfast was incredible. It was large. I mean, it had almost anything you wanted. We actually like to drink grapefruit juice in the morning, and not everyone wants to provide you jus au pamplemousse. Yeah. But they had it. They had it like a cheese plate. They had a cold cut plate. They made it in the morning. Nice. They had those lovely little touches where on the cheese plate, they put like a raspberry framboise and then put microgreens around it so it looked like a flower or a plant. I mean, it was just done well. That's nice. So are these people French? They're French. Okay. They're French. And they even, outside the pool, there was a little room. They had an honor bar in that room where you could buy a bottle of wine and just pay for it in a jar. Nice. Or they had stacks. So nice. It was a comfortable place to stay. I think including breakfast, and they have their own private parking in the little garage. I think it was €175 a night. That's really reasonable. I thought it was reasonable. We looked at some hotels, and then when we considered the cost of parking and other things, this made more sense. It would be more comfortable. Well, and also when you stay at a place like that, they have recommendations for restaurants and places to visit and things like that. Not that it's hard to find a good restaurant in Bergerac, but it's good to know of the ones you should prioritize, I guess. Yeah, you have a personal touch because you have hosts. Yeah. They're not hovering around, but you need them. They're there to help you. That's excellent. Their English was pretty good. We spoke both in French and English. My wife's French is pretty good. I can communicate a little, but their English was good enough. If we spoke no French, we would have been fine. Okay. Good to know. Very good recommendation. Thank you. Yeah, I would certainly recommend that. So what did you enjoy doing in Bergerac? Well, in your podcast, you had talked earlier about visiting cathedral and the church and a chateau. In our case, again, we like to trek. And so we walked down to the river, and there's a lovely promenade along the river, and it goes through a nice little residential area. Yeah. And so if I'm going for a long walk, 2 hours, a little more than 2 hours along the river, it's very nice. and we saw rowers. We saw teams of women training rowing scull and also some single scull.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always interesting. Paddle here. I've been paddling in a six-man canoe all my life. And so it's interesting to see the water sports there.
Yeah.
And then another morning, there is a variant of the Chemin de Compostelle that goes through Bergerac. And so the second morning, I took that for a way. We had planned on going to a neighboring village, and then it followed the route followed a small country road more than a single track trail. There was traffic on the road off and on. In the end, we made it a 6-mile round trip, which was, that's enough hike for us.
Yeah, that's good.
But it's lovely. And the city itself is very picturesque. Along the river, of course, there are nice views of the city from either side of the river. And then the old town, I love the half timber buildings in the old town. I think one can go see the sights, or one can just settle into the rhythm of life there and poke around.
Yeah.
Which is really what it is.
Yeah. So how many days do you wish you could have stayed?
Well, I think another night, get Bordeaux and have spent another night there. Just driven there. And because we had a car, we then would have gone out and looked at some things and gone perhaps up to the chateau.
Yeah. Very good.
But when we travel, we don't like to rush. I don't like to move at our own pace. Spoken to a little earlier. Don't need to, and we're blessed that we can do it that way.
Yeah. No, it's lovely.
From Bergerac, go Dome. It's about an hour and a half drive to Dome.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we have been to Dome before, but we like the village. And we have friends who rent a farmhouse. You may have to help me pronounce, about halfway between Bergerac and Dome. Le Buisson du Cadouin.
Let's see.
It's the village.
Yes, Cadouin. Buisson de Cadouin.
It's a nice little village. We were going to stay with them, but our schedules changed. But we stopped in the village, and there was market day going on. And that's always nice.
Yeah.
Had a little bit of time there looking at village life in the market, and then drove on to Dome.
Yeah, it's a really small village. It's a couple thousand people.
Yeah, it's not very large. And then we drove to Dome, and of course, there's drove by La Roque and Fenac.
Yeah.
And then Dome itself, again, we've been there. We stayed at Hotel L'Esplanade. And up there's a nice hotel. They have a marvelous restaurant. There's a great view from the hotel looking down into the river valley.
Mm-hmm.
In the afternoon. There's the hot air balloon coming up. We had lunch there on arrival. The restaurant here at that hotel is excellent. And then we just kind of walked around the village. There's a park up adjacent to the hotel. And the village is small, but again, if you check out every street and alley, and you find little restaurants or shops, whatever. Look at the architecture of the village. It's just an enjoyable place to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a cute little town, and it's Bastide, which makes it kind of easy to find your way around.
Right. Good Bastide town.
Yeah.
And that night we had a brasserie called Belvedere that overlooks the valley, which was simple but nice.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day we drove up to Charlotte. We had been there before, but it is such a beautiful city. And it turned out it was their market day also. We weren't aware of that. We hadn't really planned or checked the schedule. But walked around the village, walked around the market, and toyed with having lunch, but ended up going to a nice restaurant there in La Roche for lunch, and then eventually back to Dome just to kind of hang out.
Mm-hmm.
But the market day in Charlotte is really worth a visit if one hasn't already done that. It's large, and it's quite busy, and it's fun to just kind of sit and people watch.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, it's a very fun market, and it attracts a lot of people, including a lot of visitors. But, it's just very pleasant. And they have a lot of local strawberries when they're in season. And they have truffles when they're in season. They have foie gras, of course, when it's time for Christmas. So it's a lovely, lovely market.
Yeah, well, you mentioned foie gras. As you know, that's part of France known for duck. I had a bit of duck Bordeaux and Bergerac, but by the time we got the Dome, let me just say I had a duck salad at lunch at the hotel, and it was very nice. But by then I was ducked out.
Yeah.
And Christine doesn't particularly care for duck.
Yeah.
So it was nice to have other choices on the menu.
I get easily ducked out. My husband doesn't, but
Yeah.
I enjoy duck once in a while. Foie gras at Christmas, okay, but I don't go out of my way to order these menu items. But in the Dordogne, it's really hard to get away from the duck.
Right. It's there.
Yeah.
And then that evening, we had dinner at L'Esplanade. And I got to say, that dining room, very nice. The service, very good. The quality of the food is very good. It's a little pricey, but it's for the level of service and the food and the location. I thought it was a very good value. And interestingly enough, when we had dinner, when we were seated, there were 4 other tables being served. And I believe those 4 tables were all French. And I think there's 10 or maybe possibly 12 tables available. And then just before we were finished dinner, the hostess sat somebody relatively close to us, and they were speaking English. We couldn't help overhearing the conversation. And it turns out this gentleman was from Hawaii and actually was currently living on the island of Maui. Well, I was born on Maui, and of course, Christine and I live in Kona in Hawaii. So what are the chances of having dinner in a Bastille in rural France, 6 tables being served and 2 of the 6 being from Hawaii?
It's an extraordinary happenstance, I guess.
It was an interesting coincidence. So we had a nice chat with him.
That's great.
And so we took off to drive to Sancerre, and it's a long drive, 5.5 hours, most of it on autoroute.
Yeah.
But that morning when we were in Dole, it was raining, and I was surprised. It was somewhat of a warm rain. It wasn't as cold as I thought it. So the traffic on the Loto route was a little slower than normal, which is okay because it rained very hard. And we just drove drive up into several stops at various air and for rest stop and refreshments or whatever. And talking about COVID, that's the air that we stopped on and on that Loto route. They were very strict on the wearing of masks.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody walked in without a mask, they were told immediately.
Oh, yeah. You can't walk into any building in France without a mask on. They won't let you.
But, well, we noticed that, but I noticed the air seemed to be stricter than the others. They were very forward.
Mm-hmm. And by air, you mean the aire de repos. So these are the rest stops along the freeway.
Yeah, the rest stops on the freeway. Right. So eventually saw the sign to Bourges, and Bourges not far from Sancerre. And that gave us a feeling that we were getting close to home, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are surrounding villages around Sancerre that you know well. In Sancerre, we stayed at an Airbnb. It was a nice place to stay. Again, it had a nice sitting room, big kitchen, and maybe a little bit more than we really needed. 2 bedrooms with a loft. Very convenient and nice place to stay. And it's Sancerre. We talked about it in a previous podcast, but we do enjoy going back, and we go back regularly. I think every year other than 2020 since 2004. And what's unique again for us in that village, Nouvelle Place, there at in the center of the medieval village, and it's surrounded by a number of restaurants and shops. And right off the Nouvelle Place, There are other restaurants and other shops. And our friend Olivier at Cafe Liverie is a bookstore cafe that we go to, and we just sit and hang out and talk to Olivier, and our other friends come in. You know, it's hanging out. It's kind of a slice of life, or really just settle into the rhythm of life that they have.
That's
there
great.
in Sancerre.
That's great. And then I wanted you to tell me about this chateau you went to near Tours, Château de la Bourdesière.
Christine found it. We subscribed to a magazine called France Magazine.
Yeah.
And one of the articles in that magazine was about gardens in the Loire. And we have been to a lot of chateau gardens or just botanical gardens in the area around Sancerre. And when we saw this article and it mentioned the chateau, we just thought it'd be unique. And we looked it up and found out that it wasn't too pricey to stay in a chateau and visit the gardens. We just thought, let's go do it.
Yeah.
So it's just outside of Tours in Montlouis-sur-Loire. It's very picturesque, about a 2.5-hour drive from Sancerre to get there. And there are rooms in the chateau itself, and then they have some adjacent buildings. They have rooms. And then they have a large domain where they have hiking trails, 5K trails if you want to follow their path. The domain has a large forest. They have some vineyards. And as you walk through the forest, they have various forms of forest art. And then by that, basically, they take tree limbs and manufacture swirls or arches or whatever you think of. Kind of unique thing. They had kind of a glen, kind of an open meadow area where obviously large parties and functions. And just off of that, there was a trail and there was a hugging tree. They had to set up where if you're a tree hugger, you're at home there. So we both gave the tree a try to make sure it was happy, and it certainly made us happy.
That's great.
And then, it's kind of unique. They had in the garden, the garden was they had a lot of flowers and vegetables and beehives, and they had the garden set up nice. But it's also, I guess, one of the things that's unique about there is they are a conservatory for tomatoes.
Oh.
And they have over 600 varieties of tomatoes there in the garden. And they have an annual tomato festival in September. And so we missed that because we were there in October. But they also have what amounts to a conservatory of dahlias.
Ooh.
We have dahlias in our garden at home. And interestingly enough, they had a variety of dahlia called aloha. And so it was pleasant just to kind of poke around the garden and see the various varieties and how they culture different plants and vines and whatever. And so it was a nice place to stay.
Yeah.
The rooms are big, large room, large bathroom. Breakfast is in a dining room in the chateau, small dining room, very nice breakfast right off the kitchen. And then the dinners are available at one of the outbuildings next door. The dinners were not elegant. They were quite simple. We ended up having dinner there to keep it, so we didn't have to drive.
Right. Sometimes when you're staying at a chateau, it would take a long time to go out to dinner and come back, and so you might as well eat at the chateau.
And that's what we did. We did have lunch next door in the little village of Montlouis, and that was an interesting little restaurant. It's very local. We found it on the web, but it was very local. There were only local people there having lunch, and the restaurant was kind of half building, half cave. It was built into the cliff site, and what was interesting is that no one really spoke English. They knew a few words, but my French was much better than any of their English. And we don't need for them to speak English. We prefer, actually, when we travel,
Sure.
we prefer to have to try to use our French. Menus can be somewhat challenging because French menus aren't necessarily literal, but generally figured it out. And Christine liked to have fish, and they had an excellent fish there. And I had their lamb, which was good. And it was a nice rate. And wine was €3 a glass or something. I mean, it was very inexpensive.
Yeah.
And if I may, let me jump back to Bergerac for a moment. When talking about wine, very close to our accommodation, like maybe 100 meters, maybe closer, there was a restaurant that we had dinner at, and it was simple food, and as you would in France, you can order a pichet of various sizes, and they had 0.375, 0.5, and 0.75 milliliter pichets.
Mm-hmm.
They were priced at €3, €6, and €9.
Wow.
You can't get a glass of wine at a restaurant here in Hawaii for €9.
No. Yeah, that's very different about France.
Yeah, the wine was drinkable. It really was.
Yeah. You can't serve bad wine, even if it's inexpensive. People will just give you a hard time. So
they won't come back.
Right.
But back to the chateau, I would recommend it. We're coming back next year. It'll be in May when we come back. And we're toying with spending a few more nights there and using that as a location. Explore the area. I'd like to go into tour and walk around tour. Haven't done that.
Does the chateau have a pool and maybe air conditioning?
Did not have air conditioning.
Maybe some of the newer buildings do. Sometimes that's what they do. The rooms in the chateau are not air conditioned, but if you book in the periphery, they usually have newer constructions that are more modern and have air conditioning.
And the chateau was interesting. The windows, you can't open the window. Windows are closed and locked. You're unable to open and get fresh air. I think they do that because they don't have air. They do have heating,
right?
But I don't believe they had air.
Okay. And how about a pool?
I don't think so. I didn't see it. I don't recall it.
So it wasn't a fancy chateau stay, because most chateaus will have a nice pool and all that.
Yeah, no, this wasn't an over-the-top fancy chateau. This one really was for people who wanted to visit their forest and their garden. Mm-hmm. And it's old, but it was comfortable.
That's good. That's wonderful. Well, it sounds like you had yourself another great trip to France, COVID and all. And honestly, we don't know when this COVID is going to end. And so, if you can travel safely and live a little, now that we have vaccines and all that, I think it's pretty safe to get around. And like you mentioned a few times, in France, everybody wears masks indoors. I don't know what it's like in Hawaii, but here you can't walk into a grocery store without a mask. No way.
Yeah, we have the same rule here in Hawaii. Indoor for a mask, outdoors not required. But we were very comfortable in France. We were not threatened in any way. And again, we're both vaccinated and subsequently had our booster. We just felt we were safe.
Yeah, and they're really, really pushing the boosters in France.
Yeah, no, that's a good thing. I don't know what our time is like, but if we had another minute or two, I'd like to mention one other village we had lunch in.
Let's do that.
When we were at Sancerre, we took a drive to a village called, I think it's pronounced Aubigny-sur-Ner, and it's about an hour's drive west of Sancerre, a little northwest. And I had been there before. Christine normally would be going to Cours de France in the language school and taking classes. So when she was having her classes, I would drive around the villages, but she didn't take classes this trip. So we drove there, and it was their market day. They had the market set up on the on Main Street, and she asked, we didn't know where to go have lunch, but she just asked one of the vendors, and he called a woman who was a resident, and she was great. I mean, how do you ask somebody where to go have lunch? They have no clue what you want to do. But she said, if you want gourmand, go up this street. She pointed that one direction. And if you want simple, go down this street, point at another direction.
Yeah.
And so we did the gourmand, and it was about 100 meters away. It was a very nice hotel, restaurant. Check in you enter in the lobby, and here again, the receptionist was in the restaurant, and the town of Omi has a relationship with the Scots, and there was a relationship with the Stuart clan.
Mm.
And so when we were having lunch, and again, I think everybody else in the restaurant was French. When we were having lunch in the restaurant, it looked like it was the special day that people go out to have lunch. We saw a lot of families, and they were kind of dressed in their Sunday best. And I was glad that we had cleaned up a little bit to go to lunch. But we noticed that the way people paid l'addition was to go walk back to the hotel lobby.
Ah.
And as we were watching people to kind of figure out how things work, we noticed that people that actually went, and they were dressed in tweed. And you don't see a lot of tweed in France. And so we looked at them, and they were dressed more like they were from Edinburgh than they would have been from France. But we surmised that it might have been a gathering of the clan, or the remnants of the clan, so to speak. They were French. They were dressed like Scots.
Huh, interesting. Very colorful, I guess.
Yeah, very, very colorful. But, you don't see a lot of tweed, or at least I haven't noticed a lot of tweed in France.
No. Yeah, no. It's not a common item. Thank you so much. You gave us a lot of recommendations for great places to stay, to eat, places to visit. And really, I love how you take your time when you're in France. It's a leisurely trip to France. It's not the normal, boom, 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 we got to do all of these things. It's more like we'll talk to somebody and figure out where we can have a nice lunch. And that's a beautiful way to enjoy France if you have the time.
Yeah, and it's one of those serendipitous finds. It's an experience that you can't schedule. Just kind of happen.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Carl. I always enjoy talking to you because your point of view is very different. As somebody who's been to France so many times, it's like you're almost French, like you're honorary French or something.
Well, perhaps. Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much for the podcast. Been a listener from almost day one, and Christine and I look forward to hearing you on Monday.
Thank you very much, Carl.
Thank you.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Patreon, join us, no spaces or dashes. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you have been doing it for a long time. You are amazing. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Jean Knuckle and Elise Larson. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. This week, I published my January insights on French food to patrons. I'm trying to talk myself into losing a few pounds. And just to prove that it cannot be done, at least for me, I'll record a video for patrons on how to make the best crepes at home because La Chandeleur is coming up and I want you to be ready. French people are full of contradictions, aren't we? This week in French news, the French Parliament unanimously outlawed conversion therapy, the practice where no good therapists say they'll transform a gay or transgendered youth into a straight person. No more of that in France. Also this week, a French genealogist managed to identify a person who had inherited 100,000 euros from his estranged father. The man, who is in his 40s, had been living on the streets for a long time, so we all hope that he uses his newfound wealth to settle into an apartment somewhere and take good care of himself. The city of Arras has launched an investigation into who shot the peregrine falcon that lived on the roof of their cathedral. They found his body riddled with pellets and upon autopsy decided that he had died of pellets and pneumonia. The peregrine falcon is a protected species in France. Emmanuel Macron has taken his turn at the head of the European Union because it's a rotating presidency, while at the same time running the country and potentially running for a second term. Interestingly, Macron has not declared that he's a candidate for a second term, even though the election is less than 3 months away. This is normal for France. Sitting presidents have not historically declared any sooner than February. Just because he hasn't declared that he's running doesn't mean that they're not doing polls, and Macron is comfortably ahead for the first round of voting. As you know, we vote in 2 rounds in France. A private company called Orpea, they run nursing homes in France, got slapped with a terrible investigative report by a journalist who published a book called Le Fossoyeur. That's a grave digger in French. We mostly have not-for-profit nursing homes in France, and they are run by associations. Associations, of course, have employees, but the whole purpose is not to attract investors and make as much money as possible. It is to further the goals of the association, right? Orpea, on the other hand, is for profit, and it's been all over the news this week that they cut too many corners. So if you listen to episode 322 of the podcast about growing old in France, take note, Orpea got plenty of bad press this week. In pandemic news, France is not out of the Omicron wave by any stretch of the imagination. Things are easing off in Paris to some degree, but not in my department, La Haute-Garonne, as of yet. I know lots of people who test positive and must isolate, so it's not just numbers on a screen for me. 21,000 classrooms have had to close last week in France because either teachers or students have tested positive, and some testing for the baccalaureate had to be postponed from March to May as a result. Currently in France, we have 3,656 people in critical care for COVID-19 and an average of 262 deaths per day. So that's a 7.2% of dying once you're sick enough to go into critical care, and those are bad odds in my book. We're still trying to convince the unvaccinated that they have a lot more to fear from the virus than from the vaccine, but lots of them are terribly misinformed and stubborn on top of that. So it's a slow process. One bit of good news, the number of people in critical care is down by 4% compared to last week. So the number of untimely deaths should be heading down soon. Some days, as many as 500,000 people test positive in France, which is alarming. That's new people testing positive. Why do so many of us test positive? Because only 46.8% of French people have had a third dose of the vaccine. And if you only have 2 doses, you can get infected quite easily with Omicron. It doesn't mean that you'll get deathly ill, but testing positive is common when you only have 2 doses. It's actually possible to test positive with 3 doses as well, but not near as likely. Moral of the story, get your 3rd shot if you haven't already, and don't let this virus infect you so we can all get on with our lives. The French tip of the week. Il fait un froid de canard. I keep talking to people who live near the Mediterranean, and they say that they had a lovely month of January with cold temperatures but sun every day. Well, not so for Toulouse, where Elise and I live. We've had nothing but low clouds, foggy days. Some mornings it starts with a freezing fog, and the fog stays on all day. Il fait un froid de canard, vous dis-je. Please, someone rescue me and send some sun. Il fait un froid de canard. Translated literally, it is ducky cold or quacky cold. Don't ask me why we associate ducks with the cold. I have no idea. Est-ce qu'il fait un froid de canard chez vous? Patience, c'est le mois de janvier, ça va passer. On another personal note, I'll be going to Paris in February to work on some voice map tours. A posh hotel in Paris called the Mandarin Oriental has asked to license my Île de la Cité tour, but they want a custom version of it that starts and ends at their hotel. So I'll do that, and I will also work on a tour of my own to be announced soon. I look forward to going back to Paris and hoofing it all over the place. You'll find the episode page for our conversation with Carl at joinusinfrance.com/374. From there, you'll be able to see all those wonderful accommodations and restaurants that Carl mentioned and see a transcript of the episode. Next week on the podcast, an episode with Elise on the lovely city of Dijon in Burgundy. If you have great photos of Dijon that you wouldn't mind me using to illustrate the episode, email them to me, Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France travel podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.